What happens when judgment and privilege collide at 35,000 feet? In the hushed, exclusive world of first-class air travel, a woman's worth was decided in a single glance. For the veteran cabin crew of Aura Air's flagship flight, the young black woman in the strange, sculptural outfit was an easy target for their mockery. They saw a pretender, someone who didn't belong. But their cruel laughter would soon be silenced by 4 simple words that would not only shatter their careers, but expose a secret connection that reached the very top of the airline. This isn't just a story about a bad flight. It's a story about the devastating cost of underestimating someone and the hard, swift hand of karma that followed. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now let's get into it. The first-class cabin of Aura Air Flight 11 from New York's JFK to London Heathrow was a sanctuary of muted tones and expensive silence. It was a world curated to within an inch of its life. The scent of lavender and chamomile subtly infused the air. The leather on the lie-flat seats was buttery soft, and the champagne was always a vintage Dom Perignon. This was the domain of Brenda Miller, the flight's purser. With 25 years of service, a perfectly lacquered helmet of blonde hair, and a smile that never quite reached her ice-blue eyes, Brenda ruled her cabin like a tiny, tyrannical queen. Her throne was the galley, where she stood with her 2 junior attendants, Chloe and Marcus. Chloe was young, eager, and saw Brenda as the epitome of grace. Marcus was ambitious, believing that aligning with the powerful purser was his fastest track to promotion. "Watch the door, you two," Brenda said, her voice a low, conspiratorial hum. "This is the flight where you see the real players. Old money, new money, and the occasional imposter. The trick is learning to spot the difference." As if on cue, the last of the first-class passengers began to board. Brenda's practiced smile snapped into place as she greeted a silver-haired banking executive and a well-known actress. Then she saw her. The woman was tall, poised, and black. But it wasn't her race that made Brenda's smile falter. It was her outfit. It wasn't merely clothes. It was a statement. She wore a pair of wide-legged trousers made of a charcoal gray material that seemed to shift and shimmer under the cabin lights. But the centerpiece was the top. It was an asymmetrical architectural piece, a single long sleeve on one arm, while the other was bare. The fabric, a stark white, was folded and pleated into a shape that resembled a modernist sculpture, rising to a dramatic point at one shoulder. It was the kind of outfit one might see at the Met Gala or in the pages of a high-fashion magazine, created by an avant-garde designer like Anya Petrova. On the sterile corporate backdrop of the airplane, it was deliberately, breathtakingly out of place. The woman, Dr. Imani Carter, simply nodded at the flight attendants as she moved toward her seat, 2A. She carried a single, beautifully crafted leather tote bag, its rich cognac color a warm contrast to her monochrome attire. As soon as Imani was out of earshot, the venom began to drip in the galley. "Well, well," Brenda hissed, her smile vanishing to be replaced by a contemptuous sneer. "Looks like someone got lost on their way to a music video shoot." Chloe giggled, a high-pitched, sycophantic sound. "Did you see that thing she was wearing? It looks like a folded-up napkin." "Probably thinks a first-class ticket buys you taste," Marcus added, straightening his tie with a smug air. "You see it all the time. Lottery winners, Instagram influencers. They get a little money and have no idea how to act." Brenda took a sip of water, her eyes fixed on Imani's reflection in the polished galley surface. "She's in 2A, a full-fare first suite. That's a $15,000 seat." She paused for effect. "Keep an eye on her. People who try this hard to stand out are usually the most demanding. Probably wants 1,000 pictures for her social media. #living my best life." They shared a cruel, knowing laugh. Their judgment was instant, absolute, and utterly wrong. They saw a costume, not couture. They saw a pretender, not a prodigy. They had no idea that the woman in seat 2A wasn't trying to get noticed by the world. She was on her way to deliver a keynote address on quantum ethics at Oxford University. They didn't know that the napkin she was wearing was a one-of-a-kind piece gifted to her by the designer herself. And they certainly didn't know that her connection to their airline ran deeper and higher than they could possibly imagine. Imani settled into her suite, oblivious to the small-minded conspiracy brewing in the galley. She was used to turning heads. Her style was an extension of her mind, bold, unconventional, and unapologetic. She didn't dress for others' approval. She slipped off her shoes, placing her expensive tote carefully beside her, and began to peruse the menu. She was looking forward to a quiet, relaxing flight. She pressed the call button for a pre-departure glass of water. A minute passed, then 2. She could hear the flight attendants laughing and chatting with the passenger in 3D. She pressed it again. Finally, Chloe appeared, her smile strained. "Yes?" she asked, her tone clipped. "May I have a glass of still water with a slice of lime, please?" Imani asked politely. "We'll begin our pre-departure beverage service shortly," Chloe replied, already turning away. "We'll get to you then." Imani watched her go, a small frown touching her lips. She saw Chloe immediately attend to the man across the aisle, who had asked for the same thing and return with it in seconds. The message was subtle but clear. The ridicule she couldn't hear was manifesting as service she could feel. The laughter had stopped, but the contempt had just begun its descent. The Boeing 777 climbed gracefully out of New York, piercing the cloud cover and settling into the smooth, high-altitude air currents of the Atlantic crossing. Below, the world was a swirl of white and blue. Inside cabin 1A, however, the atmosphere was growing turbulent. For Dr. Imani Carter, the initial slight over the glass of water had been a minor annoyance, something she was willing to dismiss as a simple oversight. But as the flight progressed, a pattern of deliberate neglect began to emerge, as chillingly precise as the architectural lines of her outfit. Brenda led the charge, her brand of passive aggression honed to a fine art over decades of service. When she took meal orders, she approached every passenger with a warm, engaging script. "Mr. Albright, the Chilean sea bass is particularly wonderful this evening, prepared with a lemon caper sauce. Would that appeal to you?" When she reached seat 2A, her demeanor shifted. She stood stiffly, notepad in hand, and asked without a hint of warmth, "What do you want?" "I'll have the pan-seared salmon, please," Imani replied, her voice even. Brenda made a note. "And to drink?" "The Sauvignon Blanc you're serving from the Loire Valley sounds lovely." Brenda's lip curled almost imperceptibly. "Of course," she said, with an emphasis that suggested the choice was laughably predictable. The service that followed was a masterclass in professional sabotage. While other passengers' appetizers arrived promptly on crisp white linens, Imani's was delayed. When it did arrive, set down by Marcus, it was placed just a little too hard on the table, making the cutlery clatter. Her wine glass remained empty for long stretches, while the glasses of those around her were topped up with fawning regularity. Imani was not a woman prone to paranoia. Her entire career was built on logic, on observing data and drawing reasoned conclusions. The data here was irrefutable. She was being singled out. She watched Brenda, Chloe, and Marcus operate. They were a tight unit, communicating with shared glances and tiny, smug smiles. They would gather in the galley, their whispers punctuated by stifled laughter, always after one of them had interacted with her. She tried to engage Marcus when he cleared her plate. "This is a very smooth flight. The crew is handling the new aircraft beautifully." Marcus offered a tight, dismissive smile. "We're all highly trained," he said, avoiding eye contact and escaping back to the galley as quickly as possible. The cruelty was in the details. When Chloe came through offering hot towels, the one she gave Imani was lukewarm, almost cool to the touch. When Brenda distributed the amenity kits, luxurious little pouches filled with designer toiletries, she practically tossed Imani's onto the empty seat beside her, while personally handing them to every other passenger. Inside her private suite, Imani let out a slow, controlled breath. It was an old, familiar feeling, the sting of being judged and dismissed based on appearance. She had faced it in academic circles, where some of her older male colleagues initially saw her as a diversity hire rather than a brilliant mind. She had learned long ago that reacting with anger was what they wanted. It would only validate their prejudice. Poise was her shield. Silence was her sword. She decided to focus on her work, opening her laptop to review the final draft of her speech. The screen glowed with complex diagrams and dense paragraphs on the philosophical implications of artificial consciousness. As she worked, she was struck by the irony. Here she was, flying to one of the world's oldest seats of learning to discuss the future of intelligence, and she was being treated as unintelligent by people whose worldview was so painfully narrow. Hours into the flight, she felt a chill. The personal air vent above her seat was blasting cold air directly onto her. She tried to adjust the nozzle, but it seemed stuck. She pressed the call button. After a long wait, Chloe appeared. "Is there a problem?" "Yes, my air vent seems to be jammed. It's quite cold," Imani explained. Chloe reached up and fiddled with the nozzle for a moment. "It seems fine to me," she said dismissively. "Maybe just use your blanket." She walked away before Imani could respond. The cold air continued to flow. It was no accident. Imani knew that these vents could be controlled centrally from the crew's panel. They were deliberately making her uncomfortable. She wrapped the plush airline blanket tighter around her shoulders, her jaw setting with a quiet resolve. They were testing her. They were trying to provoke a reaction, to make her the angry black woman their prejudice expected her to be. She would not give them the satisfaction. Instead, she made a mental note of each slight. The delayed water, the cold tone, the tepid towel, the tossed amenity kit, the icy blast of air. She documented the times and the names of the attendants involved. Dr. Imani Carter was, above all, a scientist, and she was gathering her evidence. From the galley, Brenda watched her on the small monitor, a triumphant smirk on her face. "See?" she whispered to Chloe. "She's all wrapped up like she's in steerage. So much for high fashion. A little discomfort and the facade crumbles." They believed they were winning. They thought they were putting an imposter in her place. What they were actually doing was methodically, meticulously, and with gleeful ignorance, digging their own professional graves. And the ground beneath them was about to give way. The cabin was dark now, with most passengers either asleep or absorbed in their movies. The gentle hum of the engines was a hypnotic lullaby. It was in this quiet moment that the carefully controlled peace of the first-class cabin was shattered. The commotion came from seat 4D. The passenger was a man named Gerald Maxwell, a loud, florid-faced hedge fund manager who had been drinking steadily since takeoff. He was now arguing with his laptop, his voice rising in drunken frustration. "Work, you piece of junk! Connect!" he boomed, slamming his fist on the tray table. The sound echoed through the silent cabin, startling several sleeping passengers. Marcus was the first to respond, rushing to the man's side. "Sir, is everything all right? Could I ask you to keep your voice down?" "All right? Nothing is all right," Gerald slurred, gesturing wildly at his screen. "I need to connect to the Wi-Fi. I have a $1 billion deal closing in Hong Kong. This useless internet you charge a fortune for isn't working." "I'm very sorry, sir. Atmospheric conditions can sometimes interfere with the satellite signal. It should be back shortly," Marcus explained, trying to sound soothing. "Shortly isn't good enough," Gerald roared. His face was red and a vein pulsed in his temple. "Do you know who I am? I own half of Mayfair. I could buy and sell this entire plane." Brenda swept in, her face a mask of practiced concern. "Mr. Maxwell, please, let's not disturb the other passengers. What seems to be the issue?" "The issue is your shoddy service," he spat. "I need this to work. Now." Brenda and Marcus began to fawn over him, their voices dripping with appeasement. "Of course, sir. Let me try rebooting it for you, sir." "Can I get you another scotch while you wait, sir?" Their response was a stark contrast to the cold shoulder they had given Imani. They saw Gerald's obnoxious behavior not as a problem, but as the justified outburst of a powerful man, His anger was a sign of his importance. From her seat, Imani watched the scene unfold. She had dealt with men like Gerald before, men whose wealth was a weapon they wielded against anyone they deemed a subordinate. The crew's fawning was only making him worse. The Wi-Fi router for the first-class cabin was located in the bulkhead panel, just a few feet from Imani's seat. She had noticed it earlier. From the crew's fumbling attempts, it was clear they were just trying to refresh the connection from his device, a useless endeavor if the problem was with the onboard system. Finally, after another 5 minutes of escalating shouting from Gerald, Imani decided to intervene. She unbuckled her seatbelt, folded her blanket neatly, and stood up. As she approached, Brenda shot her a venomous look that clearly said, "This is not your concern. Go back to your seat." Imani ignored her. She addressed Gerald directly, her voice calm and clear, cutting through his drunken tirade. "Excuse me, sir," she said. "I believe I can help." Gerald turned his bloodshot eyes on her. "And who are you?" "I'm a passenger who would like to get some rest," Imani stated plainly. "But I also happen to understand these network systems. The issue isn't your laptop. The cabin's local router likely needs a hard reset." Brenda stepped forward, placing a hand on Imani's arm. "Ma'am, we have this under control. Please return to your seat." Her grip was surprisingly strong. Imani didn't flinch. She looked from Brenda's hand to her face. "With all due respect," she said, her voice dropping to a steely quiet, "you clearly do not. You've been trying to solve a hardware issue with a software solution for 10 minutes. You're upsetting the other passengers and failing to resolve the problem." She then turned back to Gerald. "The access panel is right here," she said, pointing to a small, almost invisible seam in the bulkhead. "There is a reset button for the network interface. It will take approximately 30 seconds. May I?" Gerald, momentarily stunned by her confidence, just grunted in affirmation. Brenda was speechless, her face a mixture of fury and shock. Before she could protest further, Imani used her fingernail to pop open the small panel cover. She knew from her own extensive travel and technical background precisely what to look for. She pressed the small recessed button, held it for 10 seconds, and released it. "Give it a minute to reestablish the handshake with the primary server," she instructed Gerald, her tone that of a seasoned IT professional. "Then try connecting again." She walked back to her seat without another word, settling back into her suite as if nothing had happened. A minute later, a triumphant shout came from 4D. "It's working, I'm connected." Gerald Maxwell, his anger abated, looked over at Imani with newfound respect. "Hey, thanks, lady." The cabin settled back into silence, but the dynamics had shifted. The other passengers who had been woken up were now looking at Imani with gratitude and at the crew with annoyance. Brenda, Marcus, and Chloe stood frozen in the aisle, their faces burning with humiliation. They hadn't just been shown up. They had been proven incompetent by the very woman they had dismissed as a frivolous, attention-seeking lightweight. Brenda retreated to the galley, her composure finally cracking. Her hands were shaking. This was a direct challenge to her authority, to her entire sense of order. The woman in 2A wasn't just a quiet victim anymore. She was formidable. "Who does she think she is?" Brenda seethed to Chloe, poking her nose into crew business. "It's a security violation. I should write her up." But even as she said it, she knew she couldn't. Imani had solved a problem they couldn't, and she had done it with an unnerving level of expertise and composure. The woman was an enigma, and for the first time on the flight, a flicker of fear crept into Brenda's icy heart. Her carefully constructed world of prejudice was beginning to crumble, and she had no idea the earthquake was still to come. For the next hour, the cabin crew of Flight 11 avoided Seat 2A as if it were radioactive. Their humiliation had curdled into a resentful silence. They performed their duties with robotic precision, their earlier camaraderie gone, replaced by a tense, shared anxiety. Brenda remained cloistered in the galley, her face a thundercloud. Imani, for her part, simply returned to her work. She had not intervened to embarrass them, but to restore peace and quiet. Their reaction was their own burden to bear. She was, however, growing weary of the entire charade. All she had wanted was a peaceful journey home, or what passed for home when she was in London. The call came about 2 hours before landing, not over the intercom, but in person. A different flight attendant, a man from the business class cabin whom Imani hadn't seen before, appeared at her suite. He looked nervous. "Excuse me, ma'am," he began, his eyes wide. "There's someone here to see you." Imani frowned. "See me?" Before he could explain, a figure emerged from the curtained-off crew rest area near the cockpit. He was a man in his late 60s with a warm, weathered face, a shock of silver hair, and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He was dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored gray suit, though he had removed his jacket and tie. He looked more like a friendly grandfather than a titan of industry. His face broke into a wide, genuine grin the moment he saw her. "Imani, my goodness, I thought the manifest looked familiar, but I didn't dare to believe it." Imani's professional composure melted away, replaced by a smile of pure, unadulterated affection. A light entered her eyes that the crew had not seen before. "Richie," she laughed, standing up to embrace him. "What in the world are you doing on this flight?" The man, Richard Sterling, CEO of Aura Air, hugged her tightly. "Deadheading back from a board meeting. My daughter just had her first baby in New York, so I combined the trips. I should be asking you the same question. I thought you were in Palo Alto." "Oxford," she corrected him, pulling back from the hug. "Keynote, you know, the usual 'don't let our robot overlords kill us' speech." "Ah, still fighting the good fight for us Luddites," he chuckled. "Your father would be so proud, Imani, so incredibly proud." The name Richie hung in the air, a sonic boom that echoed in the silent, gaping minds of the cabin crew. Brenda, who had emerged from the galley to see what the commotion was about, froze mid-step. Her face, already pale with anger, went completely ashen. Chloe and Marcus, who were clearing the last of the service items, stood like statues, their trays held precariously in their hands. This wasn't a business acquaintance. This wasn't a name drop. The embrace, the familiar tone, the mention of her father. This was family. Richard Sterling, the man whose corporate portrait hung in every Aura Air office worldwide. The man whose legendary attention to detail was the stuff of company terror and legend, was Richie to the woman in the strange outfit. Brenda felt a wave of nausea so profound she had to grip the side of the galley door for support. Every cruel whisper, every sneer, every deliberate act of neglect flashed through her mind. The lukewarm towel, the jammed air vent, the condescending tone. She had not just been rude to a first-class passenger. She had insulted, humiliated, and mistreated the personal guest, no, the cherished family friend, of the chief executive officer. Richard pulled the small visitor's seat out in Imani's suite and sat down, his focus entirely on her, oblivious for the moment to the drama unfolding around them. "How is Sarah? And the baby?" Imani asked, her full attention on him. "Both perfect. We're calling her Clara," Richard said, his eyes glowing with pride. "You must come for dinner when you're back in London. You know you're always welcome." "I'd love that," Imani said warmly. Then her expression shifted slightly. Her eyes flickered for a brief second towards the galley where Brenda was trying to shrink into the shadows. Richard, a man who had built a multi-billion-dollar empire on his ability to read people, caught the subtle shift immediately. He leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "Everything all right? How has the flight been? The crew treating you well?" It was the moment of reckoning. The question hung in the air, charged with unspoken weight. Imani held the careers of 3 people in the palm of her hand. She looked at the powerful man in front of her, the man who had been her late father's best friend since college, the man she had called Uncle Richie her entire life. She met his gaze and gave a small, slow, deliberate smile. "It's been an illuminating flight, Richie," she said. "Truly, one for the books." The choice of words was perfect. It wasn't a direct accusation. It was a hook, an invitation, and for a man like Richard Sterling, it was more than enough. His warm smile faded, replaced by a razor-sharp look of concern and inquiry. He looked past Imani, his gaze sweeping over his cabin crew. He saw their terrified, frozen expressions. He saw Brenda's ghostly, pale face. He saw the truth in an instant. The hard karma had not yet struck, but the thunder was rolling and the lightning was about to find its target. Richard Sterling didn't get to be the CEO of a major international airline by being unobservant. He had a reputation for a walk-around management style, often flying on his own planes unannounced to gauge the real state of his company. He could spot a loose thread on a seat cushion from 5 feet away and could tell from a flight attendant's posture whether morale was high or low. What he was seeing now set every alarm bell in his finely tuned mind ringing. He saw the stark terror on the faces of the crew. He saw Brenda Miller, a 25-year veteran he knew by name, looking like she'd seen a ghost. He processed Imani's carefully chosen word, illuminating. It was the kind of word she would use, intelligent, precise, and loaded with unspoken meaning. It was not the word one used to describe a pleasant, uneventful flight. His demeanor remained calm, but his eyes turned cold. He turned his attention back to Imani, giving her a look that said, "We'll talk about this later." Aloud, he said, "Well, I won't keep you. I know you need to rest before you go and dazzle all those academics. I'll have my driver meet you outside customs at Heathrow. No arguments." "Richie, you don't have to," Imani began. "I insist," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "It's the least I can do. We'll catch up properly this weekend." He stood, gave her hand a gentle squeeze, and turned to leave. As he walked past the galley, he paused. He didn't stop to address Brenda, Chloe, or Marcus directly. Instead, he did something far more chilling. He ran his index finger along the polished stainless steel countertop of the galley. He inspected it for a moment, then looked at his clean fingertip. He adjusted the knot on an absent tie. Then, he looked directly at Brenda, his face utterly unreadable. "Purser Miller," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "See me in the flight deck briefing room upon arrival, before you disembark." He didn't wait for a reply. He simply disappeared back toward the front of the aircraft. The command, so simple and delivered so quietly, was a death sentence. In the rigid hierarchy of the airline world, a summons like that from the CEO himself, especially after such an obvious incident, was unprecedented. It bypassed the entire chain of command, the head of in-flight service, the London base manager, human resources. It was a direct, personal intervention. Brenda's legs finally gave out. She stumbled into the galley and sank onto the small jump seat, her head in her hands. The lacquered perfection of her hair was finally disturbed as she trembled. 25 years of impeccable service, of climbing the ladder, of building her little kingdom in the clouds. All of it was about to be incinerated because she and her crew had decided to mock a woman's dress. Chloe started to cry, silent tears streaming down her face. "What's going to happen to us?" she whispered, her voice choked with panic. Marcus, ever the opportunist, was already thinking of self-preservation. "This is Brenda's fault," he hissed, his voice low and vicious. "She was the lead. She set the tone. We were just following orders." "Following orders?" Brenda snapped, her head shooting up, her eyes blazing with a desperate, cornered fury. "You were laughing just as hard as anyone, Marcus. Don't you dare try to pin this on me." Their toxic alliance, built on shared mockery, crumbled into bitter recrimination. The remaining 90 minutes of the flight were the longest of their lives. They moved through the cabin like ghosts, preparing for landing with trembling hands and hollow eyes. The other first-class passengers, aware that something significant had transpired, watched them with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Imani, meanwhile, had closed her laptop. She leaned her head back against the soft leather and closed her eyes. She felt no triumph, no glee, just a profound sense of exhaustion and sadness. It had never been about the outfit. It had been about a fundamental lack of respect, a casual cruelty born from prejudice. She hadn't asked for this confrontation, but now that it was here, she knew Richard would handle it. Her mind drifted back to her father, a brilliant aerospace engineer, and his best friend, Richard Sterling. They had been two young, ambitious men who bonded over a shared love of flight. Richard had gone into the business side, her father into the design side. When her father passed away too young, Richard had stepped in, becoming a surrogate uncle, a mentor, a steadfast presence in her life. He had always told her, "Your father designed the wings, Imani. It's my job to make sure they fly right." Now she had shown him that something on one of his flagships was flying very, very wrong. As the plane began its final descent into London, the fasten seatbelt sign chimed. For most passengers, it signaled the end of a journey. For Brenda, Chloe, and Marcus, it sounded like a guillotine. The quiet reckoning was over. The loud, brutal consequences were about to begin. The wheels of the Boeing 777 touched down on the tarmac of Heathrow Airport with a gentle screech. For the passengers, the journey was over. For Brenda Miller and her crew, the trial was about to begin. As soon as the plane docked at the gate and the engine spooled down, the normal post-flight routine was shattered. An alert pinged on the crew's internal communication system. All cabin crew for Flight 11 are to remain on board until further notice. No one is to disembark. This was highly unusual. Imani gathered her belongings, her movements graceful and unhurried. As she approached the exit, Brenda stood rigidly by the door, her face a pale, taut mask. Her earlier sneer was gone, replaced by a look of sheer dread. "Dr. Carter," Brenda said, her voice a strained, unfamiliar croak. The use of doctor was a desperate, last-ditch effort at respect. I want to apologize. My behavior and that of my crew was unprofessional. It was inexcusable." Imani paused and looked at her. She didn't see a powerful purser anymore. She saw a frightened woman, stripped of her authority, staring into the abyss of her own making. "Was it unprofessional, Brenda?" Imani asked, her voice soft but piercing. "Or did you and your staff simply treat me the way you felt I deserved to be treated? There's a difference." Brenda had no answer. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Imani simply nodded and stepped off the aircraft into the jet bridge, where Richard Sterling's personal assistant was already waiting for her. The moment Imani was clear, two figures entered the aircraft. They were not the ground crew. One was a stern-looking woman in a sharp business suit whom Brenda recognized instantly. Eleanor Vance, the airline's senior vice president of human resources, known for her merciless efficiency. The other was a man, the head of in-flight services for the entire European region. The fact that they were both here in person on the plane was a cataclysmic breach of protocol. Eleanor Vance's eyes swept over Brenda, Chloe, and Marcus. "Purser Miller, Mr. Davies, Miss Chen," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "You will be escorted to the corporate offices at the airport. You are to surrender your company IDs and credentials now. You will be interviewed separately. Do not speak to each other." Chloe burst into tears again, a loud, gulping sob. Marcus looked down at the floor, his face pale. Brenda, however, seemed to have found a last shred of defiance. "For what?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "A passenger complaint? This is a completely disproportional response." Eleanor Vance took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "This is not a passenger complaint, Miss Miller. This is a direct order from the CEO pending a full investigation into multiple code of conduct violations, including passenger discrimination, dereliction of duty, and the deliberate creation of a hostile environment. Now your ID." The fight went out of Brenda completely. With shaking hands, she unclipped the ID from her uniform. Marcus and Chloe did the same. They were then escorted off the plane like criminals, past the bewildered cleaning and ground crews, to a waiting car that would take them not home, but to an interrogation. The investigation was swift and brutal. Richard Sterling had made it his top priority. What they uncovered was worse than Richard had even suspected. They pulled the flight's CVR, cockpit voice recorder, and cabin audio logs from the galley and crew rest areas, a measure only taken in the most serious of incidents. The whispers, the sneers, the cruel jokes. It was all there, recorded with perfect clarity. Brenda calling Imani's outfit a folded-up napkin. Marcus speculating she was a lottery winner. Their shared laughter. It was a damning, undeniable record of their prejudice. They reviewed the internal service logs. They could see the timestamps on Imani's call button presses and the delayed responses. They could even access the cabin's environmental controls, and they found a manual override logged from the crew's main panel, lowering the temperature of the air directed to seat 2A by 10 degrees for a period of 47 minutes. It was premeditated. Then they interviewed other passengers. Gerald Maxwell, the obnoxious hedge fund manager, was surprisingly helpful. "That crew," he said in a phone interview, "they were kissing my ass while treating the lady in 2A like garbage. And she was the only one smart enough to fix my damn Wi-Fi. She was all class. They were trash." An elderly couple in the row behind Imani also provided a statement. The young woman was a perfect passenger, quiet, polite. The crew, especially the blonde one, seemed to have some sort of problem with her. They were quite rude. We noticed it. The evidence was overwhelming. It wasn't a case of one person's word against another's. It was a mountain of digital, audio, and eyewitness proof. The unraveling was total. There was nowhere to hide. In her interview, a sobbing Chloe confessed everything, hoping for leniency. She admitted to the lukewarm towel and her part in the mockery, blaming Brenda's influence. Marcus took a different, more cynical approach. He tried to frame his comments as a misguided attempt at team bonding and painted Brenda as a manipulative tyrant. He emphasized his junior status, hoping to be seen as a pawn. Brenda's interview was a disaster. She began with indignant denials. Then, when confronted with the audio recordings, she shifted to bitter excuses. "First class isn't what it used to be," she spat at Eleanor Vance. "We get all sorts in here now. People with no breeding. You have to maintain a standard." Eleanor Vance simply stared at her, her expression one of utter disgust. "The only standard you failed to maintain, Miss Miller, was one of basic human decency, a standard which is the very foundation of this company's values." The unraveling was complete. All that was left was the final, devastating judgment. A week after Flight 11 landed, 3 courier-delivered envelopes arrived at 3 separate addresses in the sprawling suburbs that orbit Heathrow Airport. They were thick, cream-colored, and bore the elegant, understated logo of Aura Air. For the recipients, these envelopes were not conveyances of information. They were verdicts, delivered with the cold, impersonal finality of a courtroom sentence. The karma they had so casually invoked at 35,000 feet had now found its way to their doorsteps, and its weight was far heavier and more complex than a simple firing. For Brenda Miller, the envelope was a bomb that detonated her entire world. She sat at her small, pristine dining table, the letter opener shaking in her hand. For a moment, she allowed herself a sliver of hope. Perhaps it was a suspension, a severe reprimand, a forced leave of absence. 25 years of service had to count for something. She had been a loyal company woman, a fierce defender of its brand, or so she told herself. She slit the envelope. The words "termination effective immediately" seemed to leap off the page, blurring before her eyes. The letter continued, a cascade of corporate jargon that translated into pure devastation. Gross professional misconduct, violation of Covenants 7.4 and 11.2 of the Employee Code of Conduct, irreconcilable breach of company trust. It was a legal assassination, but the true cruelty lay in the subsequent paragraphs. Her 25-year service package, the golden parachute she had mentally spent 100 times on a quaint cottage in the Cotswolds with a rose garden, was void. Her termination was for cause, a legal distinction that vaporized a quarter-century of loyalty in a single clause. Her formidable pension, the bedrock of her future security, would be frozen and calculated at a drastically reduced, legally mandated minimum. The lifelong travel privileges, the very currency of her social standing, the perk that allowed her to jet off to Bali or Cape Town on a whim, were revoked effective immediately. She read the letter 3 times, but the meaning refused to sink in. This wasn't happening. It was a nightmare. She, Brenda Miller, queen of the first-class cabin, was being cast out like a common thief. Her mind raced, grasping for someone to blame. It was that woman, that Dr. Carter, so high and mighty in her ridiculous napkin top. And Richard Sterling, a man she used to admire, had betrayed her. He had chosen this upstart over a veteran employee. It was the world gone mad, she thought. A world of political correctness, where you couldn't even share a private joke anymore. In the days that followed, Brenda's world shrank with breathtaking speed. The first blow was silence. Her phone, usually buzzing with messages from her crew and colleagues, went quiet. Friends she'd known for decades suddenly became distant. They had all heard the story, which had spread through the airline like wildfire. She was a pariah, a cautionary tale. To associate with her was to risk being tainted by her disgrace. The financial reality began to set in. Her salary vanished. The mortgage on her meticulously kept flat, which had been manageable on a purser's income, was now a terrifying monster. She started waking up at 3 a.m., her heart pounding with a primal fear she had never known. She, who had poured vintage champagne for billionaires, was now frantically calculating whether she could afford her grocery bill. One afternoon, sitting in the unnerving quiet of her home, she heard the familiar roar of a Boeing 777 on its flight path into Heathrow. She ran to the window, a reflexive action, and looked up. It was an Aura air jet, its blue and silver livery gleaming in the sun. A physical pain, sharp and visceral, shot through her chest. It was her plane. It was her world. Up there, someone else was walking the aisles, serving the meals, living the life she had lost. She was grounded, an exile in her own life. Weeks later, desperate, she found herself in a sterile recruitment office, applying for a position as a shift manager at a large retail store in a shopping mall. The interviewer, a young woman half her age with a piercing in her nose, looked at her resume with a puzzled expression. "It says here you were with Aura Air for 25 years, the young woman said. "Why did you leave?" "I was seeking a new challenge, on the ground." Brenda lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Okay," the interviewer chirped, unconvinced. "So, you have experience with customer service. But do you have any experience with inventory management or scheduling hourly employees?" Brenda looked at the young woman. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell her about the time she calmed a hysterical diplomat, or sourced a rare medication for a sick passenger over the Atlantic, or managed a full-scale medical emergency at 40,000 feet. She wanted to scream, "I ran a multi-million-dollar silver tube full of the world's most demanding people, and I did it perfectly for 25 years. But she said nothing. In this world, her old world, she was a titan. In this world, she was an overqualified middle-aged woman with an unexplained gap in her employment history. The queen was dead. All that remained was a bitter, frightened woman in a room that smelled faintly of cinnamon-scented candles. For Marcus Davies, karma was a prison of his own design. His letter didn't bring the clean death of termination. It delivered a life sentence. The 3-month unpaid suspension was a shock, but the real blow was the permanent demotion to junior flight attendant. The words "ineligible for promotion" were branded onto his soul. His ambition, the engine that had driven his every sycophantic smile and strategic decision, had just been switched off, forever. The mandatory sensitivity training was his first taste of hell. It wasn't a group webinar he could sleep through. It was a series of one-on-one sessions with a stern, intelligent HR specialist who methodically dissected his every action on Flight 11. She played back the audio from the galley. "Lottery winners." His own voice echoed in the small, soundproof room. "They get a little money and have no idea how to act." "Mr. Davies," the specialist asked, her gaze unwavering, "what evidence did you have to support this conclusion about Dr. Carter?" It was just a joke," he stammered. "A joke based on what? Her race? Her choice of clothing? Please help me understand the thought process. What, in your view, makes a person act as though they belong in first class?" There was no escape. He couldn't charm his way out. He couldn't blame Brenda. He was forced to confront the ugly, snobbish core of his own judgment. The training stripped him bare, exposing his ambition not as a virtue, but as a shallow, corrosive force that had led him to align with a bully. Returning to work was a daily walk of shame. The whispers followed him down the aisles. The pitying glances from older crew members were somehow worse than the contempt. He was that guy, the one from the CEO incident. New hires were warned about him. He had to take orders from pursers who were younger than him, people he had once seen as his competition, and now had to address as ma'am or sir. Every time he pushed a beverage cart through the first-class cabin, it was a fresh torment. This was the territory he had dreamed of commanding. Now he was just part of the furniture, a ghost haunting the scene of his own downfall. He saw other ambitious young men and women, and the jealousy was a physical sickness. He had been one of them, but he had made the wrong bet. He had hitched his wagon to Brenda's fading star, and it had dragged him down into a permanent, humiliating twilight. His career wasn't over, but it was a zombie, doomed to walk the earth without a soul. For Chloe Chen, the path was different. It was not a cliff or a prison, but a long, arduous climb. Her month-long suspension was a period of profound shame. She had to tell her parents, who had been so proud of her glamorous job. She saw the disappointment in their eyes, and it broke her heart. She spent the month replaying every moment of the flight, her complicity burning in her memory. Her giggles at Brenda's cruel jokes, the lukewarm towel, her dismissive attitude at the call button. She had been a willing accomplice. When she returned, she was terrified. But in her training, something had shifted. Unlike Marcus, who fought the process, Chloe surrendered to it. She wept. She admitted her fear of Brenda, her desire to fit in, and her deep regret. She understood, in a way she never had before, that just going along with it was an action in itself. Her first day back, she was assigned to a flight with a senior purser named David, a kind, fatherly man who was the antithesis of Brenda. He took her aside before boarding. "I've read your file, Chloe," he said gently. "Everyone deserves a second chance, but you have to earn it. Show me you've learned." Chloe spent the next 2 years earning it. She was the first to answer a call button, the first to offer a warm blanket. She treated every passenger, from first class to economy, with the same meticulous kindness and respect. She learned to see people not as categories, but as individuals. One day, a young passenger boarded in economy, wearing flamboyant homemade clothes and bright green hair. A few junior attendants snickered. Chloe shot them a look, not of anger, but of quiet disappointment. She then went to the passenger and complimented their unique style, offering them an extra pillow to make their journey more comfortable. In that small act, she finally broke the chain of her past. She wasn't Brenda's follower anymore. She was becoming her own person. And for Imani Carter, the resolution was not about punishment, but about purpose. In Richard Sterling's sun-drenched garden, the conversation went far beyond a simple apology. "I'm so sorry, Imani," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "I build this company on the principle that the sky should be for everyone. To know that this happened on one of my planes to you, it feels like a personal failure." "It wasn't your failure, Richie," she replied softly. "It was theirs, but it revealed something, a sickness, and the only way to cure a sickness is to treat it." That's when he slid the folder across the table. When she read the proposal for the Dr. Joseph Carter STEM Scholarship, tears streamed down her face. It was perfect. Her father had been a brilliant engineer who had faced his own barriers as a young man. The scholarship wasn't just a donation, it was a legacy. It was taking the ugliness of that flight, the prejudice, the ignorance, and alchemizing it into pure opportunity. The story of Flight 11 became a quiet legend at Aura Air, but for Imani, it faded into the background. Her victory wasn't in the downfall of 3 flight attendants. Her victory was in her work, in the young women who would one day board planes to attend universities and lead companies. Their paths made a little smoother because of a scholarship born from a moment of profound disrespect. She had been judged on a superficial costume, and the final beautiful irony was that the incident had allowed her to help build the very substance of a better future. And there you have it. A story that started with a sneer and a cruel laugh in a first-class cabin ended with careers dismantled and a powerful new legacy of hope being born. It's a stark reminder that the way we treat people has consequences, sometimes life-altering ones. Dr. Imani Carter never sought revenge, but her quiet dignity in the face of prejudice set in motion a chain of events that ensured justice was served. The karma for Brenda, Marcus, and Chloe wasn't just about losing their jobs. It was about facing the hollowness of their own judgment. What do you think? Was the punishment fair? Have you ever witnessed someone being misjudged so completely? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story resonated with you, please give this video a powerful thumbs up so more people can see it. Share it with a friend who appreciates a story of real-life justice. And most importantly, if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We post stories of dramatic twists and satisfying karma every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Thank you for listening.